Hello again, and welcome to Introductory to Ethics. We're talking about Book 8 of Aristotle's Ethics in our St. Vincent series on the Introductory to Ethics. Mostly we're just going through Aristotle's Ethics, but with a few added insights. And in my usual vein, I'm going to generally cover some of the primary concepts in Book 8, which is on friendship, the nature of friendship, which is certainly, I think, something just about everyone is concerned with on some level. And I find it fascinating that here is a text, and sometimes we as moderns have these prejudices against ancient texts. We don't think that they have much to tell us. But obviously, after reading a text like this, we see how ignorant that particular understanding is, because these ancient texts truly have very much to say to us. This book reads as if it could have been written by an author yesterday, actually with possibly much better grammar even, but who knows. But why would Aristotle talk about friendship right now? I like to try to give you some context for this, because Aristotle is not random. He is not a random thinker. He's quite a reliable thinker. The last paragraph of that chapter, book 7, which is on moral weakness and moral strength, he simply says, we have stated what each is, moral strength and moral weakness, and now it remains to talk about friendship. And it's like, okay, well, that doesn't tell us a lot, Aristotle. Why are you saying that? And he's saying that because, he's discussed with us kind of the goal of human life. He's discussed the good. He's discussed happiness. He introduced everything for us. He talked about voluntary acts, involuntary acts, choices. Those are major foundational concepts. He proceeded to talk about basically the difference between moral virtues and intellectual virtues. He picked out one particular virtue to have a whole chapter on, namely justice, which Aristotle considered a master virtue, that in a certain sense, if you have justice, you really have most of the other, not quite all, but most of the other virtues. Then we have this chapter on moral strength and moral weakness, which is kind of the intensity or lack thereof of the virtues. And now, he, as a thinker, Aristotle knows that, and he says this in his introduction, there's this thing we call friendship that really seems to be indispensable for life. How could I possibly write a book on ethics without dealing with this incredibly important something? We're not exactly sure what genus it falls into yet. And that's another problem, that friendship does not easily fall into a genus. In other words, like the genus of virtues. Like, is friendship a characteristic? Like, what are the main contestants for its genus? Maybe it's a characteristic, perhaps an emotion, maybe an activity. Did I say virtue? I think, or perhaps it's a virtue, or just a kind of relation, or maybe it's a mixture of those. But do you see how friendship, unlike something like courage, well, we can immediately say that's a moral virtue because of certain characteristics. It's a moral virtue. We can easily put it into, and it can become a characteristic if it becomes a habit, right? Because it's certainly more than an emotion. and emotions simply deals with our mostly the irrational part of our soul. But if emotions are well controlled by the rational part of our soul, then of course they're quite ruly and they're far more human than beastly. So this is really the reason I think that Aristotle is discussing friendship towards the end. It's too important not to discuss, but it doesn't easily fall into a particular genus. So he needs to talk about it. That bothers Aristotle. He wants to figure this out. And there are other reasons, and we'll go into those as we discuss it. First of all, true to form, Aristotle is quite consistent, quite reliable. He doesn't really start with the question, what is friendship? That would be a little bit more, in a certain sense, deductive. He's to go right at the definition. That's not Aristotle's style, or at least it is not his style in the Ethics. Okay. First, he starts with what we know. He starts inductively. What's the title of the first chapter? Why do we need friendship? I mean, do you see how inductive that is? That he's simply talking about, well, what is it that we observe about friendship in everyday life? And let's use that as a basis to start talking about kinds and genuses, differentia, those things afterwards. Okay. So a few candidates, and this doesn't have to do with what's on the board yet. I'll just mention a few. He does mention that friendship is indispensable for life. He mentions that friendship is a refuge in prosperity, or it's really necessary for prosperity. We can have someone to share our prosperity with. Like, say you're prosperous, you're doing great. So what? How happy are you going to be if you're in isolation and you're doing well? Well, there might be a few of us, very rare individuals, who would be just fine with that. But most of us, well, we want to share our prosperity. And certainly in misfortune, we definitely need our friends. That's common sense. That should go without saying. But he also says that friendship, and Aristotle very consistently is a political thinker. He always has politics, at least in the back of his mind. And remember, politics as he means that word, not because nowadays politics has a bit of a negative connotation for us. When we think about politics, we're like, that's all that dirty stuff. But that's not what Aristotle means. Aristotle means a group of people coming together and making decisions about the common good. That's what Aristotle means by politics. It has a very positive connotation in Aristotle's mind. Politics the way that it should be, I think that we could say. Okay, if our politicians, and some of them do, some of them truly do, I think it's becoming more difficult in our society, but those individuals that do gather together and truly try to seek the common good. But imagine what kind of society we would have if everyone were friends. I mean, imagine the good that could be done if we were all held together by the bonds of what Aristotle calls concord. I mean, it would be amazing. But he has a fairly famous quote in this particular chapter. When people are friends, they have no need of justice. But when they are just, they need friendship in addition. Now, think about it this way. And he's talking about a true friendship. We're gonna discuss what that means, okay? In a true friendship, imagine the whole circle is friendship. That all the virtues are there, all the virtues. Justice is one of the virtues. You have everything if you have friendship. Justice is just a little part of this. So if you're simply just, you still need this for a perfect relationship. But if you have friendship, or if you're simply just, you still need the friendship in addition in order to have that perfect relationship. Do you see what I mean? Well, it's not what I mean. It's what Aristotle means. So friendship, in other words, has a practical use for society. So he's talking about personal things. It's certainly a refuge in sorrow and something to share in prosperity. He also mentions that friendship enhances our ability to think and act. Think about that for a second. I mean, a true friend is going to correct you if you have some blind spots, and is going to encourage you along whenever you're doing something that is good. So friendships can kind of act like batteries for us. You know, an extra cylinder to really get us moving towards happiness as the goal, towards the good. Well, that seems like a very practical sort of thing. So he goes through some of those candidates for, you know, why we need friends. And he's, I think, as a good lecturer, as a good teacher, he's kind of warming us up. He's showing us the usefulness of friendship. He's also just showing us just the pure good of friendship, not simply its usefulness. Now, I want to skip to the 3 things worthy of affection. Now, from giving us the phenomenon, giving us some reasons why we have friends, Aristotle is going to proceed to try to put some of this in categories. Aristotle always does this. He's always trying to provide us with categories for thought, because it's nearly impossible to think of anything. As a matter of fact, it is impossible to think of anything without a category. And the more numerous or precise our categories are, the better we are able to think about the thing we are thinking about, right? And that makes tons of sense. So he's going to start giving us some categories. Kind of at the basic level, these are the 3 things worthy of affection. You can see this on the board, can't you? So at the very base, affection. I have that on the side. The useful, the pleasant, and the good or the virtuous. They could rather be interchangeable at this point. So he's like, okay, well, when friends, no, that's not the right way of saying it. Well, let's just get into the discussion. I think we'll see as we go. The most basic kind of thing worthy of affection are those things that are useful. Now, we have relationships like this every day. most political relationships, economic relationships are based on this. It's like, okay, hey, I'll teach your kids if you, fix my car and do X, Y, and Z, or I'll give you some money if you babysit my children, like that. Those are relationships really entirely based on use. And there is a certain kind of friendship in quotes, because Aristotle would not call it a true friendship, that is based on simply the useful. So having friendships based on use is not bad necessarily, but it could be bad. I think we'll see that as we go. Another thing that friendships are based on is the pleasant. This is fairly common sense as well. I mean, say there's a particular fellow that you always invite to your parties because he's hilarious. Okay. The kind of the life of the party sort of person. Okay. And he's not too obnoxious. He's pleasant. He's just a good person to have around. Now, if you asked him, would you allow him to take care of your children? And your response might be, heck no. I don't want him within 50 feet of my children, but he can come to my party. Okay. Well, that's a friendship based on the pleasant. Now, you might have someone who takes care of your kids every day. And let's say you certainly have a kind of relationship with her, but you don't know too much about her. She kind of keeps to herself, but she's very responsible, and that's why you allow her to take care of your children. She's very responsible. She does what she's supposed to do. And you're asked the question, would you invite her to your party? Don't really want her around for my party, really. She's kind of not the type. Now, I'm just using a theoretical situation because she might be the kind of person that you invite to the party as well, okay? So that relationship is based on use, but she's really not a very pleasant individual, okay? See, there's a difference between, do you see the difference? And I'm reminding people that are watching this, because for all I know, it's 10 years from now and somebody is watching this video. There are some people that are online watching me, so I'm kind of relating to them. But finally, we have that relationship that is based on the true, the good, the virtuous, which Aristotle will ultimately, based on virtue. This is a kind of relationship that ultimately Aristotle says is only possible between good men and women. Only possible between good men and women. Now, there are certain conditions, moving on to the conditions, because I'm just using I need to go through broad concepts because we have a lot to cover. There's a few conditions, as you can see, that a virtuous or good friendship needs to be based on. First of all, Aristotle does end up claiming that true friendship really has to be among equals. Now, I know that's a very general statement, but remember in his society, we've looked it up, there was approximately 200,000 or so people in Athens at the time. Almost half of them were slaves. And several thousand actually had a vote in society because it was a patriarchal society. So only landed males, I believe, had the prerogative to vote. So it's a very hierarchical society. So when he's talking about equals, he has a much more clear idea um, about the superior and inferior. You know, we might have a bit of a hang up talking like that, but this is still the case, okay? Do you think that somebody like me is really going to end up being friends with, you know, state senators or someone like that? Chances are not very likely. Or you have someone who has a very, very poor education, as opposed to someone who has a very, very refined education. That is a massive inequality. That doesn't mean that there can't be a tremendous kind of love and affection between those two. But to truly call it a friendship, according to Aristotle's definition, there's too much inequality for us to call that a true friendship. Because they really can't reciprocally share the same goods. They can't reciprocally share that level of intelligence, if you want to put it that way. But these conditions need to be met. First of all, it has to be virtuous and good. That kind of goes without saying. Okay, immediately that slices off a number of relationships, doesn't it? You have to have goodwill towards that person. You have to care about them for their sake, not simply for your sake. Okay, at these two levels, the useful and the pleasant, if you think about it, you're really caring about that person. If this is the basis of the friendship, you're caring about that person for your sake. They are useful to me, and they are pleasant to me. So it's a good bit about me. That doesn't mean that you can't have some affection for them. Of course it does. But does it rise to the true level of friendship? No, it does not. You have to care about them. Really, you have to be able to take some sacrifice yourself. Surrender some honor, some wealth, some time, some goods, because you wish for their existence to flourish. That's what that means. That's pretty much what Aristotle says. That knocks out almost all relationships, okay, just right there. I don't mean to be negative, but come on. It has to be reciprocal. In other words, I have to be willing to do that for you, and you need to be willing to do that for me. That cuts out even more, doesn't it? I might really be willing, like I might identify you as, no, I want this person as a friend. You actually have to agree with that. That doesn't happen all the time, does it? As a matter of fact, it rarely happens. Aristotle says that as well. You have to be aware of this reciprocal relationship. Now, what does that mean? Without studying this a little, have you ever met someone who's, and this would be a little more likely in, say, high school, but it still happens. You're talking with an acquaintance, and you consider you like them, you know, you find them pleasant, or you have goodwill towards them, but they're just an acquaintance. And all of a sudden they drop a bomb on your head and say, oh, don't you know you're my best friend? And you're like, ooh, whoa, really? And you're surprised by that statement because you didn't think that at all. You know, you care about them, but you certainly don't put them in like the BFF category, you know, best friends forever, right? So in other words, you were not aware of the kind of affection that they had for you. And Because of that, it's not truly reciprocal. It has to go both ways. You're sharing different kinds of love, and therefore it's not equal, right? Okay. Then on top of that, so that knocks out some more people, okay? There has to be time and familiarity. And what more can we say about that than, well, that literally it takes time. And it requires trust. Because of course, once trust is violated, and you know that as well as I do, it's very difficult to gain it back. It's possible, but that takes more time, doesn't it? So that cuts out some more people. So can we blame Aristotle when he says quotes like, "Such friendships are rare, of course, since such people are few"? I mean, perhaps you may disagree, but he makes a good bit of sense here. And when he means such people, he means people capable of this reciprocal exchange of virtuous friendship. Now, in our society, North America, right? There are Canadians and Americans in this group. When it has been estimated that possibly as much as, and I've tried to look up some figures, but as much as a whopping 15 to 20% of our population as being narcissistic, psychopathic, sociopathic, or addicted, severely addicted. Those people are all really rather necessarily focused on themselves. Are they possible of fulfilling? Is it possible that they could fulfill these qualifications? We have a lot of work to do in our society. Okay, you can, now I'm not saying that these people are incapable of friendship, just all friendships. That would be too broad a statement. But are many of them incapable of friendships? There are numerous psychologists that would say absolutely. They can have relationships, but they're necessarily going to be rocky because of whatever traumas they've gone through, whatever blocks that they have, possibly through no fault of their own, and some other things through fault of their own. Very hard to pull those things apart, isn't it? So this is difficult. This is quite difficult. So these would be kind of some, and you could put equality up here. This kind of implies equality, a lot of the things that I put up here. And necessarily, if you're also good and you're equal, and you fulfill these categories, this friendship will necessarily be stable. Because what is stable is long-lasting. It is not easily shaken. Now, what about friendships among the wicked? How stable do you think that those are? Friendships among, and I've been a chaplain at addiction hospitals and such. The drama that goes on there that has to do with relationships constantly being broken or violated and renewed and broken again, and I mean, it's sad for them, but they have this this internal difficulty that makes it very difficult, if not impossible, for them to fully give themselves. As long as they have this addiction kind of holding them in chains, they're necessarily being prevented from fulfilling some of these categories, making their friendships terribly unstable. I mean, do you see how that would follow? And please realize I'm talking in very broad terms. That's all I can do to try to summarize a topic that's so difficult. So there are some other categories. Well, there's another primary category, namely an ally. Now, an ally or a friend is always an ally, but is an ally always a friend? How about that one? A friend is always an ally. An ally is someone that you band together with in order to proceed. You have a particular object that you're trying to reach with that ally. You have a particular activity that you're trying to engage in. And I think that the example that I used in class is a decent one. That say you're on a sports team. And this sports team has a terrible coach. It was just a rather incompetent coach. And you want to get rid of the coach. You want a decent coach. So you have whatever, let's say 5, 6 people that really aren't friends of yours, but you band together to try to get this coach out of there so that you can have a good coach. They're not your friends, but they are your allies. And once that goal has been achieved, then usually the alliance, right? Allies and alliance, the alliance falls apart. Now, it doesn't have to fall apart. It's possible that a friendship could develop from being an ally, but it has to start fulfilling these categories. And that's a big old question mark, as we've seen, right? Another thing I think is worthy of mentioning, something that's a relationship that is truly reciprocal. I've heard people say things like this, and it kind of bothers me. I know that sometimes they're saying it kind of figuratively or poetically, but they'll say something like, "My dog is my best friend." If that's true, that is very sad. I see what you're saying when you say that, because I would love to have a dog. In a monastery, we're not allowed to have dogs. And I may end up saying it myself sometimes, but kind of tongue in cheek. And the reason why it sometimes bothers me, and it would bother Aristotle as well, that's why I'm bringing it up, is that dog truly able to offer equal affection and intelligence with you? Come on. That does not meet these categories. It's certainly, usually always pleasant, but on a very, very basic level, on a very animal level. So we need to be careful when we kind of imbue animals with human-like qualities, because when we do that, what we end up doing is we cheapen human nature by doing that. We cheapen human nature by bringing animals up to a human level. It's just not rational. It's not rational. And so, saying it kind of figuratively would be fine, because Lord knows I'd love to have a dog, even a ferret. I've had ferrets before. Okay. But a best friend is not possible unless you're actually saying that you are on the level of a dog, which is a terrible thing to say. Or if you're saying that dog is really on a level with you, which is just simply patently false. You're capable of a universe more activity and thought than an animal. So it's not rational to say. But in our times, some people are saying things like this, and it's not very sane. It's not very rational, and we can use philosophy to hopefully discuss some of these things with individuals and help them refine some of their categories. So, could you stop for a moment? All right, a few more categories as we continue looking at some of the basic concepts in Book 8. Aristotle does mention perfect and imperfect friendships. Really, it's already been implied in what we've already been discussing. A perfect friendship would be one in which each receives in all manners what is given, is the basic definition. So however much intensity you share with these things with another person, they also share them with you. That would be perfect. As long as there's some kind of equality there, that's considered perfect, meaning complete. Not perfect, meaning without flaw. We tend to think about the word perfect, from the verb, I believe telutao, to complete something. It just means it's finished. It doesn't mean it's absolutely without flaw. Okay, so the finished friendship, as complete as it can be in this life. The imperfect friendship is really, first of all, it can be unequal. And so by definition, it's imperfect if it's very unequal. Or when the object that you are seeking from the other is different than what they are seeking with you. Now, of course, the truly perfect friendship is you really want to share what's truly noble, what's truly good. You want to share contemplation, you want to share virtue. But say they just want to share with you just the fact that they think you're pleasant. They enjoy your company. That's not necessarily bad, but it's not perfect. It's imperfect. So I think that really suffices. And it was really implied by some of the discussions that we've already had. Now Aristotle gets into trying to define friendship a little bit more closely, because we get to a chapter, chapter 5, entitled Friendship as a Characteristic and an Activity. So he gives us two. Do you see how there's a tiny bit of waffling there, in a way. But at first, he tells us that friendship seems to be a kind of characteristic, because certainly in a good man or woman, friendship seems to be something stable, and a characteristic is stable. That it's not simply based on emotions, which are often very, very unruly. So it must ascend above the level of the merely irrational. It must certainly go to the rational level, but not only that, something habitual about it. Otherwise, friendship would be unreliable, and all of these would fall apart, wouldn't they? So so that means that friendship seems to fulfill some of the requirements of a characteristic. But there's a problem here, because just think of the way that we talk about friendship. I can say that person is a courageous person. That person is a very prudent person. That person is a very kind person. But that person is a very friendship person. Like it doesn't, like friendly maybe, but a virtue seems to be, it's an activity, and it's an activity of the soul, right? A virtue is an activity of the soul, a certain excellence of the soul. In a certain sense, it's something, it's a habitus, it's something that we have. But do we really have friendship? Not exactly. See, that's where it gets a little, and Aristotle knows this. There's more of a relation that is implied with friendship. I have courage, but I don't exactly have friendship, because it depends on who you are and what you're giving back to me. Do you see? Do you see how friendship can't just be a characteristic? Because characteristics are something that we have. And I never have friendship. I can only have friendship with you. That's a relation. So Aristotle immediately understands that saying that friendship is merely a characteristic, we must go beyond that. So an activity seems to fit friendship a little bit better. Friendship is something that we do. And it is an activity in accordance with virtue that involves other people who must, by the very nature of friendship, reflect back to me that same kind of relationship. So it does appear to fall into the category of an activity, but it would have to be a virtuous activity, because wicked men and women can't really share in it. It's simply too unstable. It's too unequal. So do you see how there are elements in the definition of virtue? There are elements of characteristic, and there are elements of activity. And it does seem like later on, Aristotle kind of comes down a little heavier on the fact that friendship is an activity. Friendship is something we do. It's a very living, active relationship, but that it requires virtues, and it requires specific virtues that must be reflected back by the person that we wish to share our friendship with. So I think that for our purposes, let's say that Aristotle mostly calls friendship an activity. I think that's the best answer, but it does have qualities of a permanent characteristic among good people. And it requires virtues in order to exist, right? And of course, virtues are excellences of what? Of activity, right? So there's a similarity there. Okay. So I think that, and he says, there's just some things that I think are worth mentioning here. Old or sour people do not often become friends. Sometimes Aristotle just sort of throws out a few lines. Neither old nor sour people are apparently disposed to forming friendships. Now, I think the fact about what he says about elderly people is arguable. It depends on whether or not you've grown old, I guess, well or badly. I've seen very bitter old people, and I've seen some elderly people that have been really the most wonderful people I've ever met. There is only little pleasure one can get from them, and no one can spend his days in painful or unpleasant company. We see that nature avoids what is painful more than anything else and aims at what is pleasant. Okay, so the basic lesson to get from this, if you want friends, maybe you should be friendly. I don't know. That's perhaps a news flash for some people. But, you know, if you're consistently negative, remember, in order to have a true friendship, it must be useful. Of course, that person is of use to you because they're a support for your contemplation and your virtuous activity. They are pleasant because it's an immensely pleasant thing to share those things with them. And it's also fulfills all these categories, making it also good and virtuous. So the good friendship fulfills all of those categories. But if you are not pleasant, if you are consistently negative, or in however your unpleasantness manifests itself, you know, I've met people, they will not stop talking, for example. They're difficult people to be around because you would kind of like to talk about some things that interest you now and then and have an actual conversation with them. So, I mean, there's a number of different unpleasantnesses that can come about. And that makes it not impossible, but nearly impossible for you to ascend to that higher level. And I do think that that's worth mentioning in this particular section. I have talked about friendship between unequals. Aristotle does say that a kind of friendship is possible between unequals. Does it truly ascend to the top of that pyramid? Not really, okay? But he says when friends, or when two individuals, let's call them friends, because it is a kind of friendship, are unequal, the superior one should receive more affection. I mean, again, he has no problem talking about categories of superior versus inferior. In other words, if there are unequal friends, then there should be some proportionate exchange. Proportionate exchange. A proportionate exchange is not an equal exchange. Let's say we're unequal in the sense that that I am quite useful, that I can provide you with goods and services. And let's use a medieval example. You're really hilarious. I've said that. You're like a court jester, okay? You provide me with a great deal of amusement. And I provide you goods and services because, well, you provide me some entertainment. Those are two different things. So you can't be equal. What you're offering is different, but they have to be proportional. Our economy is based upon proportional exchange. It's, you know, how do we really decide how much this book is worth? Well, I mean, it's worth it. It's money, usually money. That's usually how we provide some sort of proportional exchange, or how much a service is worth. Those are two different things, money versus services, or goods versus services. So there has to be a proportional exchange there, but is it really equal? It can't be equal. Can't be equal. Even, former trades, it's like, okay, well, I'm going to come and I'm going to help you do some of your farming. Okay, well, how many chickens is that worth? Because you're going to give me some chickens for that. Proportional. Okay. But so we can have a friendship based on different objects, the useful, the pleasant, or simply the good. And there could be a friendship there in the sense that some of these qualifications are met, but it's definitely imperfect, right? We've already, you see how Aristotle's already covered perfect and imperfect before he goes into talking about friendships between unequals. In other words, he's setting up the discussion. Do you see how logical that is? So he's definitely quite logical. Now, exactly, what is the proportion? It is the function of prudence to be able to know. The virtue of prudence is the master virtue which determines the mean in all things. So really, what is the proportion? What is fair? What is just, which would be the object? It's prudence that figures that out. And if you're imprudent, of course, the friendship remains completely unequal. And there's not even a proportionate exchange. Something is truly unfair, unjust. But Aristotle would say, if you've at least come up with the right proportion between unequals, that is just. Because remember, there was a whole section in the chapter on justice concerning proportional justice, right? He's setting us up to understand some of these concepts. You see how brilliantly, again, how systematically his mind works. So friendship, I want to go from there to friendship and justice in the state. And this seems rather out of place. And in a way it is, but I want to try to help you with that. And I do have a little bit of a diagram on the board. Let me read to you how Aristotle sets up the prelude to talking about friendship and justice in the state. In other words, he's talking about all these qualifications for friendship and kinds of friendship, and all of a sudden he starts talking about forms of government. Like, what? Aristotle, what are you doing? Like, does maybe the monk who copied this book down, 1,000 years ago, made a mistake, but not necessarily, not at all. All associations seem to be parts of the political community. All associations and all friendships are part of a political community. We can see that readily. All the friendships we have exist in this larger culture that we have, right? But the kind of friendship prevalent in each will be determined by the kind of association that it is. Now, what is he saying there? Now, first of all, he is making a very much a relation between the kinds of friendships we have and the political community. We could go into this very deeply. I'm only going to kind of skim the surface. What he's basically saying is that in various forms of government, which I have written up on the board and I'll explain very briefly for a moment, the kinds of friendships that would be prevalent in, say, a tyranny. We all know what a tyranny is. It's very bad. You know, you have a tyrant, someone who's taken over, will be very different than the kind of friendship that you could have in, say, a free constitutional system, which he calls a democracy. I mean, I think that goes without saying, but it's a very interesting point. Now, exactly how would they change? That would be really a topic of massive research, okay? But just imagine what friendships look like in Canada and the United States in comparison with friendships in China, for example, or friendships in the Islamic world that are governed by some very, very strict laws regarding worship and morality. Wouldn't it be necessarily true that the kinds of friendships, their whole tenor would change? Now, that's one point. Another point is, in a larger way, Aristotle is making a point about the sort of, remember I spoke about concord? Concord. The Greek would be homonoia with this, the translation, which is really a political concept. Homonoia is the original word for what's translated as concord. Concord is that sense of common good that a society holds. What is important to that society? Concord is kind of a basic form, a very loose and basic form of friendship. You know, like, well, do we agree on how we should get our health care? Do we agree on some basic understanding of, say, foreign relations? Do we agree on whether or not we should have a capitalistic system, maybe a socialistic system? Those issues have to do with the common good. If we agree on those, we have concord. Can you see that word? No. Concord. If we disagree on those, we have faction. Okay. Now, in a friendship, of course, concord necessarily exists, where we have some basic agreements on what constitutes not only the political common good, but what's good for our relationship. We have some basic concord. But that notion of concord is going to change depending on the political system in which that friendship is found. We might say it that way. This Aristotle, and this is Aristotle's, this is not mine, this is Aristotle's graph, basically. I put it up in graph form. This row is considered negative. I know you might be interested in seeing that democracy is considered negative. I'll get there, okay? And these forms of government are positive. And then on this side, this is rule by the one, rule by the few, and rule by the many, okay? You see how nice and clean that is. Wonderful categories to think in. Or are there many exceptions to this? Of course, because we're not, this is just talking about political rule. This doesn't mean mixing the notion of political rule with a kind of economy. That would be really something different. They would be very related, but they're not the same thing. Who's ruling? is the question here. Okay. Kingship is ruled by a monarch, a single monarch, a king or a queen or whatever we want to call them, that has the good of his or her subjects as his primary goal. Now, what does that sound like? Doesn't friendship have to be for someone else's sake? Do you see the similarity there? This row, all of these forms of government rule for the sake of the ruled. Whereas the ones on this side rule or have power for the sake of themselves. That's the basic distinction. Okay, do you see that? You see that? And the difference is, of course, the kingship is one, tyranny is one. Aristocracy is a group, you know, a certain, let's say the old Roman Senate, whenever the Roman Senate was considered virtuous and noble before the coming of the Caesars. That we might consider that a kind of aristocracy. The rule of a group of noble, intelligent individuals. Okay. A timocracy is the kind of government that the founders of the United States were considering. That you have certain individuals, like it's a wider than just an aristocracy. You know, people with property, people with a true stake in society, who are ruled by some kind of constitution. Like there's some laws there, but there's some virtue there, and those things exist for the sake of everyone. Whereas democracy, its bad form, is just ruled by the mob. Just whatever the mob wants, it votes for. I want to vote for all of these extra benefits. I want to take these benefits from those who are supposed to have more, and I want the goods that they have. Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote his famous work called Democracy in America, looked towards a future for the United States where he saw that it was very likely, if not the fact that he just prophesied it, I can't exactly remember, that he could see the United States degenerating from a democracy into just mob rule. A democracy in the sense of the people really don't care what's just, they just want what they want. So, and our founding fathers, American founding fathers, that is, because there are some Canadians here present, considered, because of Aristotle's teaching, considered democracy a negative form of government. We did not found this nation as a democracy, properly so called, where just everybody just gets a vote. That could quickly end up becoming extremely unruly, if not riotous and destructive. Okay, and I think that we're possibly seeing some of the evidence of this in our political climate today, but that's an entirely different discussion. But what I want you to see is some of those basic rules for friendship he's applying to politics for other people's sake, for the sake of the ruled, and for the sake of themselves. Not only that, but there's an additional point that friendships are, I mean, certainly you're going to have to be a great deal more careful, particularly in an oligarchy and a tyranny, because the government is much more going to watch you, right? Is going to watch if you're creating what it calls factions, but what you just call a friendship. But your beliefs are different than the ruling party, and therefore it might tear you asunder. Right? So, and that's one of the reasons why Aristotle consistently calls politics the master science. Because guess what? It makes the rules about even how friendships might work. It makes the rules about what we study in science. It makes the rules about how we exchange goods and services. It makes the rules about what we consider just and unjust. Is it not still fair to say that politics could be called the master science? Now, that is a generalization, but all of these are fairly large generalizations. But I think that some of those categories still work today as a basic schema for us to understand a little bit more about politics, a little bit more about friendship. And where I would like to end, because this is, I think, something that and I'm skipping over some basic concepts. I've told you that several times, that I'm hoping to at least give you enough information where you can fill in the blanks yourselves, kind of a general overview. On the last page of this particular book, Aristotle has a very, very wise thing to say. Friendship demands the possible. It does not demand what the giver deserves. Think about that for a minute. It demands the possible, not really what you think you deserve. In some cases, in fact, it is impossible to make the kind of return which the giver deserves. For instance, in the honors that we pay to the gods and to our parents. Here, no one could ever make a worthy return, and we regard a man as good if he serves them simply to the best of his ability. I mean, how wise and prudent that is. One of my politics professors, Dr. Sandoz, used to say, do not make the best the enemy of the good. Do not make the best the enemy of the good. In other words, the people that you have around you are the only ones that you have. And you shouldn't necessarily punish them because they don't fit your ideal. You have what you have. And that doesn't mean that you shouldn't continually try to seek what might be better for you, of course. But friendship does demand the possible, that even when we do have, this does not exist in absolute perfection. I think that we could say that fairly clearly. It is an ideal. It is an ideal picture. And we can get closer to it or further away. And sometimes when we do have a true friend, someone that we consider a true friend, I think that those things rather can exist like the tide, that it can go out and that it can come in. That there are some times that we give more, and there are some times that we receive more. And there's those beautiful times when we're absolutely equal at the same time. And that's kind of that's a friendship in full flower, right? But even our planet goes in seasons. And I think that friendship goes in seasons as well. And Aristotle knew that better than anybody. So I will handle book 9 soon. Thank you for your attention.